Well, I've got two different devices pointed at me right now, so if one of them actually succeeds in recording this episode, you'll probably notice that I'm turning to the other side occasionally. I don't know which one of these is going to turn out. I hope one of them does. But this is another segment in this series that I'm doing on affective reasons to have faith. And this to me is the most important reason of all, in that it's the most obvious. It's the one that um, is the most powerful. I think it's accessible to all of us, and that is the moral imperative that drives us to do certain things, or even more, not to do certain things. I think that this is probably an even stronger feeling when it tells us don't do that. Uh, Sometimes the positive feeling drives us forward to make a certain choice, but it's especially irresistible when it's telling us to draw back from something. Now, you may feel that uh, all of this is cultural conditioning. This is what I hear from a lot of people. When you talk about morality, they'll say, well, of course you have strong feelings about do this and don't do that because you've been hearing that since you were in the cradle. That's how we're all brought up. Um, and different societies have different lists of things that they're supposed to do and supposed not to do. Actually, that's incredibly untrue to a very great extent. Societies throughout history and in very different places around the world have had remarkable overlap in the things that are approved, whether it's the 12 Tables of Rome or Solon's laws for Athens or the Ten Commandments or uh, Quranic commandments or Hindu um, texts. It's really quite remarkable that there's such a degree of similarity. Now, our skeptic could argue, well, not really, because human societies have a lot of similarity. Let's say the prohibition of adultery, it's in the interest of society to preserve the nuclear family. So, of course, there's going to be some kind of commandment against breaking up the family. Um, that it seems to me overlooks the. I mean, that's kind of a good example in a way because it does. A lot of moral commandments do have a practical, pragmatic, utilitarian value in terms of how they hold society together. So I'd rather choose another example, and always love to talk about specific examples when the subject of morality comes up. We really need something in this vague area to be able to sink our teeth into. Let's take something that I wish I could say were a really universal truth, and that's a defenseless, helpless, harmless, innocent, a baby. Doesn't everybody feel outraged when a baby is violated in some way, brutally punished, or not fed, or not clothed? I I struggled with this because we have uh, apparently a lot of elected representatives that think it's okay to take a baby who's born alive after an abortion and just lay it on the table and let it whatever it does, starve to death or freeze to death. I can't imagine. I'm struggling for words. I can't imagine what goes through the minds of people like that who think that that's okay. Oddly enough, it's a little easier to get through to people if you have, say, a 2-year old. There was something on YouTube the other day about a 4-year old, looked like he was about 4 or 5, a toddler who was being brutally abused by this fat slob who was sitting on a sofa and pulling the kid up by his ears and obviously submitting him to torture. Uh, the outrage against that was universal, and it ought to be. I mean, that's my appeal to you. Don't you feel something coming from you when you see that kind of abuse that uh, you don't really have to meditate upon? That it's just it arises instantly. Do you really think that comes from the way that you were brought up? Don't you think, on the contrary, that people who do not feel that surge of outrage must have been brought up in cultural conditioning that deprived them of a natural sympathy. In fact, this is a little bit off topic, but I'm afraid that the increasing push to have abortion permissible and legal all the way up to and including the few days after birth, or maybe some people have suggested a year after birth. Are we being conditioned to have so little sympathy for a child that will have no problem at all when the day comes to turn us loose on our fellow citizens and go out and shoot them down? Is there some kind of end game there that involves complete desensitization of basic human moral feelings? Because this natural feeling that we have for innocent victims is, how could it be taught? Well, you say, or the skeptic says, people are not born knowing right from wrong. The little kid doesn't know that it's wrong to snitch a bowl of ice cream from the kid sitting next to him. Of course it's taught. Well, that's kind of facile, really. We're not born being able to add 2 and 2 or multiply 6 by 7 either, but that's not really something that's inductive. Mathematical knowledge is already in the structure of the mind, but of course the mind of an infant or a toddler is not able to do math. It takes a while for the intelligence to be able to mature to the point that those operations can be processed. And it is the same with morality. You have to develop a sense of self and other, and this is something that the feeling that another person is a human being like you and has freedom and certain rights the way you do. This is something that grows naturally into the intelligence as the person matures. I hear the argument a lot that, well, you talk a good game about Christians having their faith because they believe in morality, but some of the most immoral people I've ever known have been Christians. Well, you know what? I'm not going to slap that back at you and say no, because I would say 2 of the top 5 and maybe the top 3 most backstabbing, duplicitous, sneaky, hypocritical people I've ever known were people who had their Bible very prominently on their desk at work and would always start up a prayer at the drop of a hat. And people like that disgust me as they disgust you. No, my question to you is, where does that disgust come from? It's righteous indignation. You're indignant, I'm indignant. Why? Where does that come from? If there is no God, and if there is no pipeline from another dimension that gives us this sense of right and wrong, then why would we begrudge another intelligent primate like ourselves a clever manipulation to get ahead, to get on top of the heap? Because that's what people who are quoting scripture all the time and flashing their Bible, and meanwhile they're just using that to set you up because you think they're honest and you're won over by their piety, and really they're so going to screw you as soon as they get the chance. That would be normal, right? I mean, that would be like a leopard sneaking up on a gazelle. That's just survival of the fittest. Why would you be outraged by that unless you had an innate sense of right and wrong? And again, where does that come from, if not from some other dimension? That's part of our natural intelligence, and we tap into that even when we feel this outrage, and it's appropriate outrage at people who are, quote, pious hypocrites. One of the most disturbing examples, to get back to another example involving children, that I've ever found in all of history is the Aztec practice of taking 9, 10-year-old girls, laying them down on the altar of the sun. The priest gets a knife and he cuts out the throbbing, living heart of that poor child that's being held down and offers it to the sun god. And apparently, this was something that they did by the hundreds. It's hard to believe that they had enough girls to provide all the parts, all the blood that was found in their temples. And, you know, this in our politically correct era should instantly be filed away under the heading of, well, that's just the way they did things. I wouldn't take a little girl and cut her heart out, and I hope my next door neighbor wouldn't. But then we were brought up in a different culture. That was their culture. That was how they were brought up. And so who are we to say that it was wrong? I hope you're not one of the people who would actually make that argument. I have to believe if you're a responsible, sane adult human being, you're disgusted by that act as you would be by a Nazi rounding up a woman with a babe at her breast and pushing them into the gas chamber at Auschwitz or Treblinka and turning on the gas. We don't have any sympathy for that guard. We didn't even have any sympathy in Nuremberg for all the Nazis who said, well, we were just obeying orders. That was their culture. They were told by someone higher up to do that. We said, no, 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 no. You're a human being. You knew that was wrong. And in fact, when I was much younger, I remember the My Lai massacre, which Lieutenant Calley ordered his men to conduct upon a village where a bunch of women and children were slaughtered. It was just every man, woman, and child, shoot them all. And I believe I'm correct in saying that the military allows soldiers to disobey orders in cases like that. And I certainly think that's true, and it certainly should be true. Because even though you're in uniform and even though you're conditioned to obey orders in all circumstances, and even though this was a war, it was a terrible war, there were actually children who would walk up to soldiers acting like they wanted a piece of candy, and then they'd have a grenade or have a gun hidden in their clothes or something. Little kids. It was actually a more complicated situation than it might seem. But nevertheless, we expect young men in situations like that to say, no, I'm sorry, Lieutenant, I'm not going to do this. You're insane. This is not right. And in fact, we expected the whole platoon to say no. I forget exactly how it turned out, but it didn't turn out well for Lieutenant Calley. And it didn't turn out very well for the Nazis who gassed all those poor, innocent, defenseless people. So why would we have a special tolerance for the Aztecs? Now, okay, we know that the Aztec people must have been, even the people who offered up their daughters for sacrifice apparently thought that this was a great honor. For all we know, the little girls may have wanted to volunteer because they were so brainwashed into thinking that this was an honor. But doesn't it prove the strength of cultural conditioning? Don't we have to just stand back and wonder at what it was in Aztec society that brainwashed so many thousands upon thousands of people to accept such a horrid practice? What that historical example proves is that moral lights can be dimmed and even just snuffed out if society is for some reason twisted enough to get into people's heads. That's not an example of a voice from within speaking in a diametrically opposite direction. That's an example of human culture overriding the voice from within. I just have to believe that you understand what I'm saying. The true voice of conscience is God speaking to us. It's not an infallible voice. It can get garbled. It can even be silenced. But over the long haul, sooner or later, that voice, I think, shouts over all the static, and we hear its message. And that's coming from God. It's a proof of the existence of God, or it's as good as a proof as you're going to find.